What if a single sentence could shatter a billionaire's empire? In the heart of New York City's most exclusive restaurant, a titan of industry, a man who could buy and sell entire city blocks decides to humiliate a young waitress over a trivial mistake. He yells, he demeans, he threatens. He expects her to crumble to cry to beg for her job. But she doesn't. Instead, she looks him dead in the eye and says 7 words that stop his heart, freeze the entire room, and unravel a dark secret he thought he had buried forever. This isn't just a story about a bad tipper. It's a story of how the ghost of a forgotten man returned to claim justice from the one who destroyed him. Aethelgard's wasn't just a restaurant. It was a statement. Nestled in a quiet, tree-lined street on the Upper East Side, it was a sanctuary of old money and new power, where reservations were whispered about months in advance, and the soft clinking of Christofle silverware against Bernadotte porcelain was the prevailing soundtrack. The air was thick with the scent of white, truffle vintage Bordeaux, and an unspoken agreement that the rules of the outside world did not apply within its mahogany-paneled walls. On this particular Tuesday evening, the gravitational center of the room was a corner table occupied by Beckham Devereaux. At 67, Beckham was less a man and more a monument to predatory capitalism. His face, a road map of ruthless decisions and sleepless nights, was framed by a mane of silver hair that was perfectly, almost aggressively coiffed. His suit was a custom-tailored Tom Ford, a dark grey armor that probably cost more than the yearly salary of the young woman currently refilling his water glass. Beckham Devereaux had built his empire, Devereaux Capital, by devouring weaker companies. He was a shark who saw the world as an ocean of bleeding fish, and he had feasted well for 40 years. His companion tonight was a nervous young man named Leo, a junior vice president who laughed too loudly at Beckham's non-jokes and nodded with the frantic energy of a bobblehead doll. "The deal is dead, Leo." Beckham growled his voice, a low rumble that cut through the restaurant's gentle hum. He didn't look at Leo. He stared at the intricate dance of bubbles rising in his champagne flute. The Henderson board got cold feet. "Cowards." "Unbelievable, sir." Leo stammered, his filet mignon forgotten. "After all your work, it's a disgrace. It's an inconvenience." Beckham corrected his gaze, finally flicking to Leo, cold and dismissive. "A temporary one. But it has soured my mood." As if on cue, a new figure approached the table. She was tall and slender, moving with a practiced grace that belied the exhaustion in her eyes. Her name was Maya, and her waitress uniform, though starched and immaculate, couldn't conceal the quiet intensity that set her apart from the other staff. She was 24, and in her other life, the one that began after her shift ended at 2 a.m., she was a mechanical engineering prodigy, tinkering with schematics and prototypes in a cramped Queen's apartment. But at Aethelgard's, she was just a waitress. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Devereaux?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. Beckham didn't answer. He waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that said, "You are scenery, and the scenery is currently bothering me." Maya's eyes flickered with a brief, unreadable emotion before she composed herself. She reached for the bottle of Sancerre, resting in a silver bucket beside the table. "More wine, sir." As she leaned forward, Leo, in a clumsy attempt to appear enhodged, gestured emphatically while making a point about market volatility. His elbow connected squarely with Maya's forearm. The heavy bottle tipped. A cascade of chilled white wine flooded across the pristine white tablecloth, splashing onto the sleeve of Beckham Devereaux's $1,000 suit jacket. Silence. Leo froze his face, turning the color of chalk. Maya's hand, still holding the bottle, trembled almost imperceptibly. Beckham Devereaux looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his grey sleeve. He didn't move for a full 5 seconds. The air around the table grew frigid. He then slowly, deliberately lifted his head, and his eyes, like chips of granite, locked onto Maya. "You clumsy little fool." He began, his voice dangerously low. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Diners at nearby tables paused, forks hovering mid-air. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" He continued, his voice rising with each word, a crescendo of pure, unadulterated rage. "Of course you don't. This suit costs more than you make in 6 months. This meal costs more than your rent." Maya stood frozen, the bottle still in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fixed on his. She didn't flinch. I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident," she said, her voice tight. "An accident?" Beckham scoffed, now pushing himself to his feet. He was a tall man, and he used his height to tower over her to intimidate. "Incompetence is not an accident. It's a character flaw. People like you. You drift through life with no ambition, no care, spilling things, making messes for other people to clean up. You are a drain on the system." Leo was trying to melt into his chair. The maitre d', a polished man named Mr. Dubois, was rushing over his face, a mask of professional panic. "Mr. Devereaux, please. The restaurant will of course handle the dry cleaning, any and all expenses." Beckham waved him away with a furious slash of his hand, never breaking eye contact with Maya. "I don't want your money. I want competence. I want people to do the one simple job they are assigned. Is that too much to ask? Or is the entire world populated by useless, clumsy children?" He was shouting now. Every eye in Aethelgard's was on them. The humiliation was thick, a physical presence in the room. He wanted her to cry. He wanted her to break. It was a display of power, a primal assertion of his place at the top of the food chain. Maya simply watched him, her expression hardening from shock to something else, something cold and too ancient. She took a slow breath, and the trembling in her hand stopped. She placed the wine bottle carefully back on the table. And then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It was quiet, clear, and carried a chilling weight that sliced through Beckham's tirade and reached every corner of the silent room. "My father's name was Arthur Reed." Beckham stopped, his mouth still open, the next insult dying on his lips. The name meant nothing to him. It was a random, nonsensical statement. He narrowed his eyes. "What did you just say?" Maya took a small step closer. Her chin lifted. The fear was gone, replaced by a righteous fury that had been simmering for 15 years. She repeated the name slower this time, each syllable a hammer blow. "Arthur Reed. You probably don't remember him." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every single person in the restaurant lean in. Then she delivered the sentence that would change everything. "But he remembered your face until the day he took his own life." The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was a deafening, crushing void. Forks clattered onto plates. A woman gasped. Leo looked like he had seen a ghost. Mr. Dubois stood rooted to the spot, his jaw slack. Beckham Devereaux's face, which had been a mask of crimson rage, drained of all color. His eyes widened, a flicker of some long-buried memory, trying to claw its way to the surface. Arthur Reed. The name echoed in the vast, empty chambers of his mind. Reed Innovations, a small tech firm he'd gutted 2 decades ago, a hostile takeover. It was just business, 1 of 100. But the girl's eyes, they held a terrible certainty, and the last words took his own life. The entire gilded quiche of Aethelgards was frozen, trapped in the orbit of this one waitress, and the billionaire she had just emotionally disarmed. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been annihilated. Beckham Devereaux, the titan of industry, stood there exposed and utterly, terrifyingly silent. The ghost of Arthur Reed had just walked into the room, and no one knew what would happen next. The silence in Aethelgard's stretched for an eternity, thick and suffocating. Beckham Devereaux stood motionless, the world having shrunk to the space between him and the waitress. Arthur Reed. The name was no longer a vague echo. It was a screeching alarm in his mind, pulling a dusty file from the deepest, most sealed-off archive of his memory. Reed Innovations. A small-time inventor with a big idea. A patent for some kind of kinetic energy converter. It had been a particularly nasty acquisition. Devereaux had seen a kernel of potential in the tech, not to develop it, but to bury it before it could disrupt a more profitable energy sector he was heavily invested in. He'd bled the company dry, leveraged its assets against it, and bought it for scrap. It was a Tuesday. Or maybe a Wednesday. Just another deal. He looked at Maya. Truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the shape of her jaw, the intensity in her dark eyes. And beneath the anger, he saw a ghost. He saw Arthur Reed's face, not as the defiant CEO across a boardroom table, but as he'd last seen him in a grainy newspaper photo, accompanying a small article about a bankruptcy and a subsequent family tragedy. Beckham felt a cold dread snake up his spine, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a child. He who could move markets with a whisper was completely powerless. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The carefully constructed artifice of his life, his power, his invincibility, had been cracked open by a 24-year-old girl in a waitress uniform. With a choked sound that was half gasp, half groan, he turned on his heel. He didn't grab his coat. He didn't say a word to Leo. He simply walked stiffly at first, then faster, pushing past the stunned maitre d' and out of the restaurant's heavy oak doors into the cool night air. The cacophony of New York City traffic was a welcome relief from the tomb-like silence he left behind. Back inside, the spell was broken. A low murmur erupted through the restaurant as everyone began talking at once. Maya stood her ground, her breathing ragged, the adrenaline of her confrontation finally hitting her. Her whole body began to shake. Mr. Dubois approached her, his face a mixture of pity and professional necessity. "Maya," he said softly, "go to my office, please." She knew what was coming. In Mr. Dubois' cramped, paper-filled office, the verdict was delivered with regretful finality. "I have to let you go, Maya," he said, avoiding her gaze. "You understand, don't you? Mr. Devereaux is one of our most important patrons. An incident like this, I can't have it. The restaurant can't have it." Maya just nodded. She didn't have the energy to argue. "I understand, Mr. Dubois." "For what it's worth," he added, pushing a thick envelope across the desk. "What you did took guts. A lot of people have wanted to say something to that man for a long time." The envelope contained her final pay, a generous severance, and a bonus for discretion. It was hush money. She took the envelope and walked out, not through the dining room, but through the back, past the clatter of the kitchen and the sympathetic glances of her now former colleagues. As she stepped into the alley behind Aethelgard's, the reality crashed down on her. She was jobless. But as she leaned against the cold brick wall, a strange sense of liberation washed over her. For 15 years, the story of her father had been a private agony, a silent weight she carried alone. Tonight, she had given it a voice. 15 years earlier, Maya Reed was 9 years old. Her world was her father's workshop, a converted garage that smelled of solder ozone and possibility. Arthur Reed was a brilliant gentleman with perpetually ink-stained fingers and a mind that saw the world in terms of energy and flow. He wasn't a businessman. He was an inventor, a dreamer. His creation, the kinetic core, was his masterpiece. It was a device that could capture and store ambient kinetic energy from footsteps on a floor, from the vibration of a subway train, from the sway of a skyscraper, and convert it into usable electricity. It was revolutionary. Reed Innovations was a small, hopeful company, run on passion and shoestring budgets. Arthur had poured every penny he had and every penny he could borrow into the project. He believed it would change the world. Then Beckham Devereaux came along. Devereaux Capital didn't express interest in a partnership. They launched a full-scale assault. They bought up their debt from the bank. They filed nuisance patent lawsuits to drain their legal funds. They poached his key engineers with offers he couldn't possibly match. Devereaux's strategy was simple: strangle the company until it was too weak to resist, then buy the corpse for parts. Maya remembered the change in her father. The light in his eyes dimmed. He stopped sleeping. The joyful humming in his workshop was replaced by frantic, hushed phone calls. The final boardroom meeting was the breaking point. Devereaux, in his prime, was a viper. Maya's mother later told her what Arthur had recounted that night, his voice hollow and broken. Devereaux had not just dismissed the kinetic core. He had mocked Arthur personally. He'd called him a naive fool playing with toys in his garage and told him he was unfit to run a lemonade stand, let alone a tech company. He had systematically dismantled not just Arthur's business, but his very identity. 2 months later, after the bankruptcy was finalized and they'd lost their home, Arthur Reed drove to the George Washington Bridge and never came back. His note was short. "I'm sorry," it said. "He took everything. There's nothing left." Maya and her mother were left with nothing but grief and a mountain of debt. Her mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, her own dreams turning to dust. Maya, even at 9, understood. She knew the name: Beckham Devereaux. It became a dark mantra in her mind. She promised her father's memory that she would not let his work die. She excelled in school, focusing on science and math with a singular burning intensity. She got a full scholarship to Columbia for engineering. She took the waitressing job at Aethelgard's, the kind of place she knew men like Devereaux frequented, not with a concrete plan, but with a simmering hope that fate might one day grant her an opportunity. She never imagined it would be like this. Now standing in the alley, she clutched the envelope of money. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Beckham Devereaux had run from the restaurant. He had run from her words. But she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he couldn't run from the ghost she had just unleashed. Beckham Devereaux's limousine cut through the New York night, a silent, leather-lined cocoon shielding him from the world. But for the first time in decades, the chaos was on the inside. His hands were shaking. A fine sheen of cold sweat covered his brow. "Arthur Reed," he muttered to himself, the name tasting like ash. His driver, a stoic man who had been with him for 15 years, glanced in the rearview mirror, his expression uncharacteristically concerned. "Everything all right, Mr. Devereaux?" Just drive. Beckham snapped his voice hoarse. He arrived at his penthouse, a sterile expanse of glass and steel overlooking Central Park, but the panoramic view offered no comfort. He strode to his bar and poured a generous amount of Macallan. 25. His hand, so unsteady that the amber liquid sloshed over the rim of the crystal glass. He downed it in 2 gulps, the burn in his throat doing nothing to quell the fire in his gut. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the waitress's face, Maya's face, her eyes burning with a righteous fire. And behind her, the hazy, half-forgotten image of her father, Arthur Reed. He remembered your face until the day he took his own life. The words were a relentless echo, chipping away at the fortress of denial he had built around his past. He had destroyed hundreds of men, thousands of careers. It was the cost of doing business, the collateral damage of empire building. He'd always told himself it wasn't personal. He'd compartmentalized, rationalized, and forgotten. He had to. To carry the weight of every broken life would have been impossible. But this girl, this waitress, had made it personal. She had reached through time and shoved the consequences of his actions directly into his face. Suicide. The word was ugly, final. It wasn't a number on a balance sheet. It was a life he had ended as surely as if he had pushed Arthur Reed from that bridge himself. The next morning, Beckham arrived at the Devereaux Capital offices, looking haggard. His usual aura of intimidating power was replaced by a volatile, raw-nerved tension. He stormed past his assistant's desk without a word and slammed his office door shut. His first call was not to his traders or his board members. It was to Philip Croft, his chief legal counsel, and perhaps his only real friend. Philip was in his late 70s, a shrewd, quiet man who had been with Beckham from the beginning. He was the cleaner, the fixer, the keeper of secrets. "Philip," Beckham said, his voice strained, "I need you to find something for me. Everything you can. A company I acquired around 2010. Reed Innovations." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Reed," Philip mused. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. The kinetic energy patent. What about it?" "I want to know what happened to the founder, Arthur Reed, and his family." Beckham said the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "I need to know everything. Discreetly." "Is there a problem, Beckham?" Philip asked, his tone laced with caution. "Just get me the information, Philip." Beckham growled and hung up. His day was a blur of unfocused rage and anxiety. He yelled at Leo over a minor discrepancy in a report, nearly firing him on the spot. He stared blankly out of his floor-to-ceiling window, the bustling city below, looking like a colony of insignificant insects. The waitress's words had become a virus infecting his thoughts, corrupting the operating system of his life. Meanwhile, another person who had been at Aethelgard's that night was having a very different kind of morning. Genevieve O'Connell was a seasoned investigative journalist for the New York Sentinel. She had made her name exposing corporate malfeasance and the hypocrisy of the 1%. She hadn't been assigned to be at Aethelgard's. She was there for a quiet anniversary dinner, a rare night off. But a good reporter is never off duty. She had seen the whole thing. The spill Devereaux's volcanic eruption of entitlement and the waitress's quiet, devastating response. She hadn't heard the exact words, but she had seen their effect. She saw a titan of Wall Street crumble. She saw him flee the restaurant like a common criminal. That wasn't a story about bad service. That was a story about a secret. The next morning, Genevieve was in her office, a coffee in one hand, her mouse in the other. She started digging. Beckham Devereaux incident. Aethelgards. Nothing. The restaurant's PR was clearly in overdrive, and the wealthy patrons were a tight-lipped tribe. But Genevieve had other methods. She had a source, a busboy at the restaurant, who owed her a favor. A quick call and a promise of $100 gave her the name of the waitress, Maya. No last name. He also gave her the phrase he'd overheard, Arthur Reed. The name Arthur Reed, when cross-referenced with Beckham Devereaux, hit pay dirt. Articles from over a decade ago appeared. Devereaux Capital acquires struggling Reed innovations. Then a few months later, a small tragic piece from a local New Jersey paper, local inventor Arthur Reed dies in apparent suicide. The article mentioned he was survived by a wife and a young daughter. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the story. A billionaire's corporate raid linked to a man's suicide. The waitress Maya had to be the daughter. It was a direct line from past tragedy to present confrontation. Now she needed to find Maya. Fired from a high-end restaurant, no last name. It was a challenge. But Genevieve was relentless. She started with public records, searching for any Arthurs Reed who had passed away in the tri-state area around that time. She cross-referenced them with property records looking for a wife and daughter. It was painstaking work, a digital needle in a haystack. After hours of dead ends, she found it. An old address for an Arthur and Helen Reed. A new address for Helen Reed in Queens. And listed at that same address, a 24-year-old woman registered to vote Maya Reed. Genevieve stared at the name on her screen. She had her. Now came the most delicate part, making contact. She knew this young woman had just lost her job and detonated a bomb in her own life. Would she be willing to talk? To go on the record against a man as powerful and vindictive as Beckham Devereaux. Genevieve picked up her phone. This story wasn't just about clicks and headlines anymore. It was about giving a voice to a ghost and holding a powerful man accountable for the lives he'd broken in his ascent to the top. The truth, she knew, was a debt that always came due, and she was about to become its collection agent. 2 days after the incident at Aethelgard's, Philip Croft walked into Beckham Devereaux's office and placed a thin beige folder on the vast expanse of his mahogany desk. Philip's face was grim. "You asked for the story on Arthur Reed, Beckham," he said, his voice low. "It's all in there. The acquisition timeline, the legal filings, the press clippings." He paused, pulling a single sheet of paper from his own jacket pocket, and the parts that weren't in the press. Beckham stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't reach for it. "Tell me." "The takeover was aggressive." Philip began choosing his words carefully. "Even for us back then. We leveraged his debt. We filed 3 patent injunctions. We knew wouldn't hold up, just to bleed him on legal fees. You publicly called his life's work a hobbyist's fantasy." Beckham flinched, the memory of his own cruel words echoing back to him. "He lost his house." Philip continued, his voice flat, devoid of judgment. "His wife Helen had to take a job as a seamstress." Arthur fell into a deep depression. 3 months after the bankruptcy was finalized, he drove his car to a secluded park and... Philip didn't need to finish the sentence. "The police report is in the file." He left a note. It mentioned the company, the failure. It mentioned you by name. Beckham sank into his leather chair, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. It was all true. The girl hadn't been exaggerating. She had delivered a cold, hard fact. "The family," Beckham whispered. "What about them? The wife Helen passed away from cancer 5 years ago." Philip said, his voice softening slightly. "Probably couldn't afford the best care. She left behind one daughter, Maya Reed, 24 years old, currently a scholarship student in mechanical engineering at Columbia University. Until 2 nights ago, she was working as a waitress at Aethelgard's to cover her living expenses. She has no other family." The room was silent, save for the hum of the city far below. Beckham Devereaux, a man who commanded legions and controlled billions, was confronted with the devastatingly simple ledger of one family's ruin. A brilliant man dead. A grieving woman worked to an early grave. An orphan forced to serve wine to her father's destroyer to fund her education. "What do we do, Philip?" Beckham asked, his voice sounding old and fragile. It was the first time in 30 years he had asked that question without already knowing the answer. "That depends," Philip replied. "What do you want to do? How I can make this go away? We can prepare a statement, paint her as a disgruntled, unstable employee. We can leak a story about her being fired for theft. We can bury her." He let the ugly words hang in the air. "Or," he continued, his tone shifting, "we could try something else." Before Beckham could respond, his private line buzzed. It was his head of a woman with a notoriously unshakable demeanor. Today she sounded frantic. "Beckham, you need to see this. It just posted. The New York Sentinel." Beckham's blood ran cold. He clicked open his web browser. The headline was splayed across the screen in bold, damning letters. "The ghost of Aethelgard's did billionaire. Beckham. Devereaux's ambition. Drive an inventor to his death." Below it was a picture of him looking arrogant and powerful next to a smaller, older photo of a smiling, hopeful Arthur Reed. The article written by Genevieve O'Connell was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It laid out the entire story, connecting the dots from the ruthless takeover of Reed Innovations to Arthur's tragic suicide, culminating in the explosive confrontation at the restaurant. Genevieve had quotes from anonymous former employees of Reed Innovations, describing Devereaux's brutal tactics. She even had a short, poignant quote from Maya Reed herself. "My father believed his work could help people," Maya was quoted as saying. "Mr. Devereaux saw it only as an asset to be stripped and buried. He didn't just bankrupt a company. He destroyed a good man. I've spent my life living with the consequences of that." The story was going viral. It was on social media, being picked up by news aggregators. At Devereaux's ghost was trending. Devereaux Capital's stock ticker, visible on a screen across his office, was suddenly flashing red, ticking downward with alarming speed. The world he had so meticulously controlled was shattering, all because of one waitress and one journalist who had dared to speak the truth. His first instinct, the one honed by a lifetime of combat, was to fight, to crush them. He looked at Philip, his eyes blazing. "Get our legal team. We sue the Sentinel for libel. We sue the girl. We—" "On what grounds, Beckham?" Philip interrupted calmly. "Is the story untrue? You know it isn't. A lawsuit would mean discovery. It would mean depositions. It would mean putting Maya Reed on a witness stand to tell the entire world under oath what you did to her father. Is that a fight you want to have?" Beckham stared at his old friend, the fury draining out of him replaced by a profound sense of dread. He was cornered. For the first time, his usual weapons, money, power, intimidation were useless. Worse, they were liabilities. "So what do you suggest?" Beckham asked, his voice barely a whisper. You wanted to know what happened to the family, Philip said, his gaze steady. Now you know. The question is, what are you going to do about it? He slid the beige folder across the desk. Read the file, Beckham. Read about the technology you buried. Read the police report. And then you decide what kind of man you want to be. Philip turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Beckham alone with the ghost he had created and the story that was now burning down his kingdom. For Maya, the day had been a whirlwind. Genevieve O'Connell had been respectful, empathetic, and sharp as a tack. Talking to her had been cathartic, like lancing a wound that had been festering for 15 years. Seeing the story published was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Her phone was buzzing with messages from friends and strangers offering support. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her grief. That evening, as she was sketching out a new design for her father's kinetic core, a more efficient, modernized version she had been working on for years, there was a knock on her apartment door. She opened it to find an elderly, well-dressed man standing in the hallway. He had kind, tired eyes. It was Philip Croft. "Miss Reed?" he asked gently. "My name is Philip Croft. I'm Mr. Devereaux's legal counsel. May I have a moment of your time?" Maya's guard went up instantly. "If you're here to serve me with a lawsuit, you can give it to me now." Philip offered a sad smile. "No, nothing like that." He held up a hand. "I'm not here to threaten you, Miss Reed. I'm here because my client has finally been forced to confront a past he should have reckoned with long ago." He extended a sleek black briefcase. "Mr. Devereaux would like to offer you a settlement, an apology for what it's worth, and a chance to move on to live your life without financial worry." He opened the briefcase. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a cashier's check. Maya leaned forward to read the amount. It was for $10 million. Next to it was a document, a non-disclosure agreement. $10 million. It was a staggering sum. It was enough to finish her degree, without worry, to buy a house, to travel the world, to never work another shift in a restaurant again. It was freedom. It was silence. She looked from the check to Philip's face. He wasn't looking at her with malice, but with a deep, weary sadness. He was a man doing his job. Maya thought about her mother counting pennies for groceries. She thought about the eviction notice on their door. She thought about her father's broken voice on his last good day. And she thought about the blueprints spread across her table, the legacy he had left her, the world-changing potential that Beckham Devereaux had tried to bury. She looked Philip Croft in the eye, her voice as clear and steady as it had been in the restaurant. "You can tell Mr. Devereaux," she said, slowly pushing the briefcase closed, "that my father's life is not for sale." Philip Croft's presence felt like an intrusion in Maya's small, tidy apartment. He stood in his impeccably tailored suit, a figure from another world, holding a briefcase that likely cost more than her entire deposit. On her kitchen table, which doubled as her workspace, lay the scattered blueprints and schematics of her life's work, the modern incarnation of the kinetic core. They were a testament to her father's genius and her own relentless dedication, and Philip's shadow fell across them like a blight. "Miss Reed," Philip said, his voice gentle but firm, cutting through the tense silence. "I am not here to threaten or intimidate you. On the contrary." He placed the sleek briefcase on the only clear space on her small coffee table and clicked it open. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. "Mr. Devereaux is aware of the Public discourse surrounding recent events. He deeply regrets the pain this has resurfaced for you and would like to make amends. Inside the case, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a cashier's check. The string of zeros was dizzying. $10 million. Next to it lay a thick document, its header stark and clinical confidential settlement and non-disclosure agreement. Maya stared at the check, her breath catching in her throat. $10 million. A wave of vertigo washed over her. She saw in a dizzying flash an altar. No more scrimping for rent, no more exhausting double shifts. The ability to help the community, to finish her education without the crushing weight of debt, to live a life free from the constant grinding anxiety of financial precarity. She thought of her mother, whose hands were gnarled from decades of hard work, who never got to see a day of ease. This money was a phantom limb, the ghost of a life they could have had. The temptation was a physical thing, a sweet, cloying poison in the air. Philip saw the flicker of conflict in her eyes. "It is a chance to move on, Miss Reed," he said softly. "To put this all behind you and build a future of your own choosing. He asks for nothing in return, only your discretion." Only your silence, Maya thought. The price was her voice. The price was her story. The price was the truth. She lifted her gaze from the check and looked at the blueprints on her table. They were covered in her own handwriting, complex equations and small, hopeful notes. "Dad would have liked this," she'd written, next to a new capacitor design. This was her father's legacy. Not the tragedy of his death, but the brilliance of his life. To accept the check would be to agree that his life's work, his dream, could be bartered for. It would be to agree with Beckham Devereaux's fundamental valuation of her father, a problem to be paid off, a nuisance to be silenced. Her spine straightened. The conflict in her eyes cooled into a hard, clear certainty. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady and devoid of tremor. "For 15 years, my father's name was a ghost. For 15 years, the man who destroyed him slept soundly in his penthouse while my mother worked herself into an early grave." She took a step forward, her hand hovering over the briefcase, not in temptation but in judgment. "You come into my home, which I can barely afford, and you offer me money that to your client is nothing. You offer it as a solution, but his actions created a wound that money cannot heal." She finally looked him directly in the eye, and Philip saw in them the same unbreakable spirit he'd seen in a few defiant founders Beckham had crushed over the years. "You can tell Mr. Devereaux," she said, slowly reaching out and pushing the heavy lid of the briefcase closed with a definitive thud, "that my father's life is not for sale, and his legacy is not open for negotiation." Philip Croft, a man who had brokered deals worth billions, who had stared down the most aggressive lawyers in New York, simply nodded. He felt no sense of failure, only a profound and weary respect. He picked up the briefcase, a tool of a world that had no power here. "I will tell him," he said, and with a final lingering look at the determined young woman before him, he left. When Philip returned to the penthouse, Beckham was pacing before the great glass wall overlooking the city, a caged predator. "Well," he barked, spinning around. "Did she sign? What's the final number?" He still believed it was a negotiation, that her refusal was a tactic. Philip placed the briefcase on the bar. "There is no number, Beckham. She refused." "Refused?" Beckham scoffed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "Everyone has a price, Philip. You didn't offer enough. Go back with 20. It wouldn't matter if it were 100. Philip said, his voice imbued with a finality that stopped Beckham cold. She didn't even hesitate. She said her father's life wasn't for sale. She looked at that check like it was an insult. Beckham stared at his old friend, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his fortress of self-assurance. His ultimate weapon, the sheer brute force of his wealth, had failed. It was like firing a cannon at a ghost. The world had ceased to operate by the rules he had written. A profound sense of impotence washed over him, leaving him feeling hollowed out and terrifyingly old. Then, what now? He asked the question, hanging in the sterile air of the penthouse. Now, Philip said, gesturing to the thin beige folder still lying on the desk. You might finally want to read that. You wanted to know what happened. The story isn't in the stock tickers or the news articles. It's in there. After Philip left, Beckham sat in the deepening twilight, the city lights beginning to glitter below like a carpet of scattered diamonds. He finally reached for the folder. With trembling hands, he opened it. He forced himself to read every word, to absorb every cold fact. He saw the timeline of his own calculated cruelty, the memos from his younger self dismissing Reed innovations as insignificant. Then he got to the last document, a scanned copy of the official police report. He read the clinical description of the scene, the make and model of the car, the time of discovery, and at the bottom, a transcription of the suicide note. He read it once, then again. The words, "I am worth nothing," were a direct echo of the insults he himself had hurled across a boardroom table. It was his voice, his judgment, that Arthur Reed had taken with him to his death. And then the final line. "I'm sorry, my little Maya. Be strong." The words leaped off the page, searing themselves into his mind. My little Maya. He saw the waitress, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fire that had been stoked for 15 years. He saw her standing in the opulent restaurant, a lone warrior against his gilded world. And behind her, he imagined a 9-year-old girl being told her father was never coming home. He dropped the paper as if it were burning his hand. A choked, ragged sob escaped his lips, a sound he hadn't made since he was a boy. The ghost that had been haunting him for days finally had a face not just Arthur's, but the face of the child he had orphaned. The weight of it was crushing, absolute. He had not just bankrupted a man. He had shattered a world. He stood up, his movements stiff, and walked to the phone, his mind clear for the first time in days. He knew what he had to do. There was no PR strategy, no legal maneuver that could fix this. There was only the truth and a single, terrifying, necessary act. "Philip," he said when his friend answered, his voice raspy and broken. "Arrange a meeting. With her. Not here. Not in some boardroom. Somewhere neutral. A park bench. Anywhere she wants. No lawyers, no briefcases. Just me." Dong. The pier overlooking the East River was desolate under a slate-grey sky. The wind was sharp, carrying the damp chill of impending rain. Beckham stood alone, stripped of his usual armor of success, feeling the cold seep into his bones. When Maya arrived, she didn't approach him directly, but stood leaning against the railing, a solitary figure against the churning water. He walked over and stood beside her, a gulf of 15 years of pain and silence between them. The silence stretched, filled only by the mournful cry of a distant gull. "Miss Reed," he began, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't come here for an apology," she said, her voice flat. her gaze fixed on the horizon. "There isn't an apology big enough." "I know," he said, the admission tearing at him. "Words are meaningless. They don't bring your father back. They don't give you back your mother. They don't erase what I did." He took a ragged breath. I read his note. At this, she finally turned to look at him, her eyes guarded, searching. "I was arrogant," he continued, forcing himself to speak the shameful truth. "I was a predator. Your father. His invention was brilliant. I knew it was, and that's why I destroyed it. It was a threat to an order that was making me rich. It was cheaper to bury a good man's dream than to change my portfolio. It was just business." He spat the word out as if it were poison. The ugly confession hung in the air. Maya felt a fresh wave of anger, but it was tempered by the raw, undisguised agony on the old man's face. "It wasn't just a dream or a business," she said, her voice tight with the unshed tears of a lifetime. "It was him. It was his hope. You took his hope, and it killed him." She finally unleashed the question that had burned within her for years. "And for what? So you could have another floor on your building, another zero in your bank account?" "Yes," he whispered, unable to meet her gaze. "That's exactly why. And it is the great moral rot of my life." Maya turned back to the river, a bitter sense of victory mingling with her grief. He had admitted it. The monster had confessed. But it felt hollow. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "You didn't bury it deep enough." She looked at him, and for the first time he saw not just anger, but a spark of defiant creation. "I've spent the last 6 years of my life rebuilding it, from his old notes from my own designs. I'm an engineer, Mr. Devereaux, just like he was, and I've made it better, lighter, more efficient, cheaper to produce. I have a working prototype in my apartment right now." Beckham stared at her, the full magnitude of his actions crashing down on him in a new and startling way. He hadn't just destroyed a man. He had suppressed a revolution. And Arthur Reed's daughter had just resurrected it. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A path opened before him. Not to forgiveness, he knew that was lost to him forever, but to a meaningful penance. "Then let me help you," he said, the words coming out in a rush, desperate and sincere. Maya recoiled as if struck. "Help me? You want to put your name on my father's work, after you destroyed him?" "No," he said emphatically, shaking his head. "My name would be nowhere near it. This isn't a takeover. This is restitution. Devereaux Capital has the infrastructure, the global supply chains, the capital to bring the kinetic core to the world. Let me fund it, all of it. We will establish a new company. You will be the CEO. You will have absolute control. We will call it Reed Industries, after your father." Her suspicion was a palpable wall between them. Why would you do that?" Beckham Devereaux, the titan, the shark, looked at the determined face of Arthur Reed's daughter. He finally understood that his wealth was not a source of power, but a tool. It could be used for destruction, or it could be used to build. "Because your father," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of his regret, wrote in his last letter that he just wanted to build something that mattered. "I have spent my entire life building an empire of things that don't. Perhaps it's time I helped build something that does." Chong. Epilogue. 3 years later. The world was abuzz with news of Reed Industries. Their flagship product, the Reed Core, was being hailed as a landmark in green energy. Cities were signing contracts to embed the technology in sidewalks and subway platforms. Architectural firms were designing skyscrapers that were almost entirely self-powering. Maya Reed, the brilliant young CEO, was on the cover of Wired and Forbes, celebrated as a visionary. The company was a unique entity. Its majority shareholder was a charitable trust established in the name of Arthur Reed, which funded STEM scholarships for underprivileged students. The board's chairman was a quiet, silver-haired man who rarely spoke at meetings, but provided shrewd guidance and opened doors that would have otherwise remained sealed. Beckham Devereaux had stepped down as CEO of Devereaux Capital. The public story was retirement. The real story was that he now poured all his energy and a significant portion of his fortune into being the silent partner of Reed Industries. He and Maya were not friends. The chasm between them was too deep, filled with too much pain. But they were partners bound by a shared, complex purpose. Sometimes after a successful product launch or a major deal, Maya would see him watching from the back of the room, a look on his face that was not quite happiness, but something like peace. He was a man paying a debt that could never truly be repaid, building a legacy of atonement on the foundations of his greatest sin. He had destroyed Arthur Reed, the man. But in the end, he was forced to resurrect Arthur Reed, the visionary, ensuring that the name he had tried to erase would instead be remembered forever. In the end, this story isn't just about a billionaire getting his comeuppance. It's about the incredible power of truth and how one person's courage can force a reckoning with the past. Maya Reed didn't just want revenge. She wanted restoration. She fought not only for her father's memory, but for his dream. And in doing so, she forced a man who had only ever known how to take to learn how to build something for the good of others. It's a powerful reminder that our actions have echoes, and a person's true legacy isn't the wealth they accumulate, but the impact they leave behind. What did you think of Maya's incredible strength? Do you believe someone like Beckham can truly find redemption? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more true stories that matter. Thank you for listening.